Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Michael Sisco show. Hello, friends. Hello. Well, the chats are already popping already. I guess everybody's excited to talk about divorce because it's such a pleasant topic. But a little before I introduce my guest, who will be patiently staring at me as I do some housekeeping. I just wanted to let you guys know I am pushing alt social media right now. I am now on MeWe. We have a page. It's in the description. We are on Parler. I got that there too. As much as we complain about big tech, we're still there. Why are we still there? We're the ones that are propping them up. So really, who cares about big tech censorship? Let's just leave. I don't know how practical it is, but once my following is as big on MeWe as it is on Facebook will be gone. But we got a long way to go, so don't worry, because I'm only at like 50 friends on MeWe, and I have 5,000 on Facebook. So, and I think I'll stay on Twitter until I get kicked off, just because I want to go out with a bang. So, yeah. Downside to it's talking to the choir. Well, I don't really care. Eventually, I think more people of the enemy will eventually go on just to mess with us. So, but as long as we're still on Facebook and Twitter, why would they? So that's where that is. But anywho, Matthew Johnston. Some people thought I was bringing on Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnston, and they got excited. Sorry to disappoint you. It's just Matthew Johnston talking about. We're going to be talking about no-fault divorce today. Welcome to the show, Matthew. Why don't you kind of introduce yourself while I set up Super Chats?
Thanks, Michael. I'm so sorry to disappoint. I'm not a doctor here, but I am currently living in the D.C. area. I work on federal grants responding to natural disasters. So that's my day job, but I kind of picked up this side interest of mine. It kind of hits home personally, but also my background in political science and just like understanding, like I really liked political theory growing up, just reading a lot of things on that subject. So kind of linking the two is kind of what I'm going to be talking about tonight, is because divorce is a messy thing. It hits home to a lot of people. They've been affected by it one way or another, but I'm kind of looking at it from a more bird's eye view, from like a systemic point of view, political point of view, and how it expands government power. So that's kind of the approach I'm going to be taking. But that's a little bit about me.
Nice. And I initially thought that you had co-founded a real group called the Americans Against No-Fault Divorce, but apparently it never actually came to fruition. So what's going on there? Are you guys still trying to put that together? Or?
Well, it was going to be a real group. So my friend Jeff Morgan, who's down in Texas, he and I are both really strong advocates on this subject. And so him and I and a group of others were going to try to start a nonprofit. Possibly as a kind of educational thing, but also as a lobbying force. But it's one of these issues that's really hard to garner a lot of popularity and public support, just because, you know, everybody's been affected by it. It's an extremely important topic, but it's one that doesn't get it's not a sexy topic. So not a lot of people, I'm surprised there's already commenters here, because this is a topic that not a lot of people even want to delve into, but when they realize what the implications are, then they understand how significant it is. So I think part of the issue is just holding off until we know, what our focus is, what our objectives are, and if we can get support, whether that's resources or manpower, things like that. So.
Nice. I just realized I left my air conditioner on, so if you hear like a hum, that's what it is. But boomer fail. So what is, just in case people don't know, what is no-fault divorce, and how is it different, I guess, than what it was like before, and what's the history of that, and how long have we had it here in the United States?
Sure. So the history of our divorce process in the United States is quite fascinating. It actually didn't involve the courts initially. It was kind of a carryover from the English system, greatly directed through the religious principles and institutions, like Christian principles and institutions, namely stemming from like the Westminster Confession and the permissibility of divorce under two grounds: adultery and willful desertion, or what you would call abandonment. And so those were two grounds under which England, I guess at the time, the Church of England was giving out divorces. And what they did was not actually bring it through the court system, but they did bills of divorce essentially through the legislatures on a case-by-case basis. So initially, if there were reasons that you want, if you fulfill these reasons that, say someone had cheated on their spouse and they could somehow prove it or something like that, or through circumstantial evidence, they would go to their legislature and ask for a bill of divorce. And so this carryover practice started developing in the colonies, and they were essentially called legislative divorces or private divorces. Essentially, they were bills given through the legislature on a case-by-case basis. Now, as you can imagine, as time goes on, and even at that time when things start to loosen up a little bit, through the political, socioeconomic, and religious development in the U.S., the legislature started giving out bills of divorce like candy, basically. And it became very political because the legislature, of course, is one of the political bodies. So, then it just kind of became this thing where, well, you get to know your representatives and you buy them a drink, and, you persuade the legislature, well, this girl, she's not, I'm kind of done with her. Can you, do me a favor? And, so that's kind of how things developed. And so it became very, very easy. And this jurist, I think his name is Thomas Cooley out in Michigan, he said basically these legislative divorces could essentially evolve into the abolishment of marriage, because essentially this institution becomes meaningless if just ad hoc you can just hand out divorces like candy, essentially what many in the Catholic Church do as annulments nowadays. Not everyone, it's not a dig, but it's the reality, because I've been in some of the Catholic circles, and some bishops do it more than others, of course. But anyway, so there was this push, particularly in the mid 1800s, to ban the practice of legislative divorces. And so if you actually go into the state constitutions, 30 of them in particular, but all of them to some degree or another, there's actually a provision in these state constitutions that prohibit legislative divorces. And they may call it legislative divorces or private laws or special laws, but it'll actually reference divorce. And so it's an added protection in addition to, the federal constitution. State constitutions have a more narrowly tailored protections for some of the important issues, and this being one of them. So the development from there led to the granting of divorce taking place in the courts. And so instead of it being a political, arbitrary, ad hoc process through the legislature would pass a general law, essentially not a particular law for each case on an individual basis, but a general law saying that this is the standard for, the state or the colony or whatever, or well, actually the state at that time. So this essentially transitioned divorce from a political decision into a decision based on rule of law, because then the courts basically have to adjudicate based on what the law says. If the law provides a ground for divorce based on adultery, then you have to provide some kind of circumstantial evidence to prove that in court. So some of the most common ones were adultery, abandonment, continual drunkenness for like a year or two, imprisonment. Different states had slightly different laws or causes of action. And so you could have as many as you wanted, basically, but the point being was that the standard applied objectively throughout the whole state. So it wasn't a case-by-case basis. And so effectively marriage was now governed theoretically under a rule of law. You know, there was a rule of action that you had to breach in order to get a divorce, because if you couldn't prove these things, fault-based grounds, then, well, it's too bad, you know, you can't get a divorce. So that's kind of the historical development. And then I would say in the 1950s, the 1960s, particular interest group, many interest groups, but the family lawyers especially, the sort of early precursors to LGBT sexual subversive groups were coming at this. Feminist groups were coming at this, and they were looking at marriage and divorce and really parroting what a lot of the philosophical undertones of the Bolshevik analysis of the family and social relations were in Russia. And so all of this literature, essentially, you can find in old, you know, Bolshevik Soviet writings about feminism and women's liberation, and, you know, the family being this bourgeois institution where the man oppressed the woman and basically claimed her as chattel. And so, you know, all of this nonsense. And so America basically bought into that. And I'd like to go there too, a little bit later, because that history is very fascinating. But basically in the 1950s, the 1960s, these groups basically started pushing for this policy policy or law called no-fault divorce, or irretrievable breakdown is usually the euphemism. But basically this was a new ground for divorce. But the difference between the past and now the modern world, or the modern context, was that previous to this, there was a false reason. There was basically a breach of misconduct that the law prescribed. And then now with this no-fault system, there's no showing of breach of any sort of rights, duties, or obligations. It's essentially on the basis of your claim that the marriage is irretrievably broken. Now, there's two forms of no-fault. One is mutual, where two people decide that their marriage is irretrievably broken. And so you don't have to show evidence, but both people at least have to agree to that term, essentially. And then there's unilateral no-fault, where essentially one person decides and the other person has no say in the matter. And so here in 2020, we have 48 of the 50 states that have unilateral no-fault, and I think 2, perhaps, in my estimation, having mutual no-fault. And so we've kind of gone away from this traditional, if you want to call it traditional, but it stemmed from the ecclesiastical understandings at the time in the Church of England, to a more loosey-goose, you know, there's more grounds for divorce, to a mutual no-fault system, and now a unilateral no-fault system. So essentially what you've got is this disintegration from, you know, you've got divine law, then you've got public law, where essentially the people have a general objective standard which you must breach to have a divorce. Then you have a couple, like the two parties involved, and now you just have the individual. And so essentially the courts at this point, they're just rubber stampers. They just, you know, you claim that the marriage is irretrievably broken. The reluctant spouse has no defense, and they have no say in the matter. Essentially, no matter how loud you kick and scream, it's pretty much useless. So that's in a nutshell where we are.
Yeah. I have a little bit of experience with this unilateral divorce thing. So I think if anyone listened to my interview with Dissident Mama on her show, they would know. If you haven't heard it, you should go listen. But so how has, I mean, you did mention that this was from feminist influence. How has this implementation of no-fault divorce affected our society, and was that part of their agenda? Was that what they were looking for?
Yeah, I mean, this in the U.S. at least, it stems primarily from the sexual revolution, and it could not take place outside of that context. During the Bolshevik Revolution, right when the Bolsheviks took power, one of the first things they did, I mean, they changed social policy first and foremost. So we usually think of socialism as this, economic system, and they did, they centralized the means of production and all that kind of stuff, and that came along as well. But many of the social policies were the first things to take place, including legitimizing children outside of wedlock, outlawing, legalizing abortion, decriminalizing homosexuality, setting up communal childcare systems so that women could go to work, communal raising of children, and no-fault divorce. And so this was essentially one of the first acts in Soviet legal theory to change the social dynamics. And the idea was to move away from this idea that marriage and divorce was about contractual rights, duties, and obligations that one owed to each other, and more based on this idea of again, a euphemism of consent and mutual affections and things of that sort. So like cohabitation. So the idea largely comes from Engels's book, actually. I have it here. The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. But basically what he talks about here is that, we're basically social animals who are polygamists, and we just like to do things without restrictions and limitations. And so this oppressive system of institutions and Christianity and all of this traditional nonsense places these unnecessary restrictions on our behavior. So the idea was to pursue this free love idea, which is very much the quintessential aspect of the sexual revolution in the U.S. But they did this in a way of codifying free love through no-fault divorce, because essentially what no-fault is cohabitation, because there's no protection in marriage that you can claim as somehow legally enforceable or legally protected, because you don't have a defense, you don't have to prove fault. So then what does that mean about the legal character of your marriage if you don't prove fault, you don't have a defense, and that you don't have a say in the matter? I mean, essentially it's a lawless law where, each individual becomes a law unto themselves. And again, the court just kind of rubber stamps this. So this developed, I mean, there were multiple changes. I think in the 1918 Family Code in Russia, it started off with mutual no fault, and then it transitioned to unilateral no fault. And that's essentially what took place here in the States. Yeah, the hippies are to blame, that's for sure. Yeah. But because we have, marriage and divorce is a state-by-state issue, all of these things had to be done incrementally. And so you had this commission essentially of family lawyers, divorce lawyers, who got together and said, we need to make this policy of the United States, but we need to do this state by state. So they started in California and actually somehow persuaded Governor Ronald Reagan at the time to sign off on no-fault divorce. And I think he was quoted later as saying it was one of his biggest regrets in public office. But I don't think he understood perhaps what the implications were, because the legislature just brought it to his desk and he signed off. But he said it was one of his biggest regrets. And it's just spread throughout the United States since then. But there's a House representative in Texas, I think his name is Matthew Krause, but he said no-fault divorce has done more to destroy marriage than gay marriage ever will. And I think what he meant by that was gay marriage is essentially poisoning the well, right? Diluting what exists as sacrosanct and traditional. But no-fault divorce basically cuts the legs off of the traditional view of marriage completely. So it's not just adding something to poison the idea of marriage, but it's actually removing marriage as some kind of enforceable contract, legally protected, as is. And so Anyway, this gets to the separation of church and state and the religious aspect of marriage and the civil aspect of marriage. But in a nutshell, the no-fault divorce law is basically a nullification clause. Basically, that marriage is kind of a legal fiction. It's an illusion that we kind of enter into, and we expect that there's some kind of protection that's involved in being legally married in the eyes of the state. And you find out that none of that's actually real, because at the end of the day, when only one spouse claims that the marriage is irretrievably broken, and there's absolutely nothing that you can do to resist that claim, then you find out, well, your marriage wasn't really legally recognized, in a sense.
Well, I mean, it's certainly, it does have quite an effect, but it seems to be one-sided when it does dissolve. So how has this specifically affected men, and as it relates to like the dynamics of the divorce, and what is the tie-in with some of the feminist stuff that we discussed earlier?
Sure. So one of the things that it's done is shifted the power dynamics substantially. So, again, when it's one party's will that becomes, in effect, legal force. Think of like the castle policies that we're talking about with, being able to protect your home from invaders and Antifa and Black Lives Matter and stuff. Do you have the right to protect your castle? Well, essentially take the same principle and apply it here. You're not dealing with Antifa thugs, but you're dealing with divorce attorneys who essentially act in the same manner, but they do so through the law. And so this system essentially breaks this lock on your door, so that these private attorneys can basically financially rape you. And they do that through many, many means, but anyone that's gone through this understands how. And that's the sad part, is that marriage is like a quasi-public, quasi-private. So on the one hand, it has public interest, but then private attorneys are able to profit without limitation on your trials through the divorce. And so what they do is initially they ask for a huge retainer. And so you pay them loads of money expecting that they're going to somehow fight for your interests. And then no-fault divorce essentially is the lock on your household that essentially is immediately broken, because that's the key that allows them to get into your domain. And so once they can basically grant the divorce, which is supposed to be a legal recognition of breach, but without that legal recognition of breach, it's like basically having a lock with a useless lock that's unlocked the whole time. And they walk right in and they say, well, now we're going to redistribute your wealth. And by wealth, I use that term broadly and liberally, because that could mean your actual wealth, your finances, that could mean your estate, that could mean the custody of your children, and even your personal rights, because a lot of men in particular wind up having to go to essentially, I call them re-education camps, but they're basically psychologists that the court mandates a lot of these men in particular to go to. And it's a much broader racket, because I think through Title IV funding, the federal government gives kickbacks for states to grant custody to the women. So the vast majority of time, the women will get custody. Not in all cases, but in statistically speaking, in the vast majority of cases, the women will get near total custody, and men will get the shaft. And that's partially due to these perverse financial incentives. So it's actually institutionalized in the system. But a lot of it's also on this, you're starting to see these ideological resentments that a lot of these corrupt judges have towards traditional views of masculinity, of family life, of hierarchy, of tradition. If you're a traditional woman, you'll probably get the worst shaft of it too. I mean, there's blatant bias from these corrupt courts towards anyone who wants to salvage their marriage or protect their property or somehow recover from this kind of destructive force of divorce. And so you've got essentially several enemies. You've got the divorce attorneys who are asking excessive rates for absolutely no benefit, because at the end of the day, you're going to be divorced because of the no-fault system, and you're going to likely lose custody if you're a man, and you're likely going to have to pay child custody as a man. And so that's basically your destiny. It doesn't matter how much or how little you pay a divorce attorney. And so once you realize that, then you stop paying the divorce attorney. But the people that don't realize it will pay and pay and pay and pay until they're essentially bankrupt. And I've known a lot of cases where men do go bankrupt, and then they're standing there with threat of having to go to jail because they can't pay child support. And that's not an uncommon thing.
Yeah. Well, that was me. For those who don't know, I do actually have kids that I haven't seen since 2013, because I thought that I was going to go to jail because I could not pay my child support, and was manipulated into signing my rights away to the new husband. And at the time, I was naive enough to think, she'll let me see them. So, but that's not how it played out. And now she's divorced from her new husband, and did the same thing to him. So,
well, what this does is it creates a perverse financial incentive for a lot of women, because if the common practice and the institutionalized legal system is such that women tend to get a lot of the financial benefit from, because all of this is, again, going back to the socialist ideology of the Bolsheviks, is a redistribution of wealth, because your money, part of it goes to the private attorneys, part of it goes to the mandatory psychologists and social workers, part of it goes to the legal fees and the judicial system, and part of it goes to your ex-wife. And so, and you're left with the rest. So it's a real system of a distribution of wealth that when people realize this, and it could be men as well, I've seen that happen, but philosophically speaking, the no-fault system was largely pushed by feminists who essentially claimed that marriage itself was a force of oppression and subservience, and that women were private property of men. And there's actually a woman during the sexual revolution, you probably heard of her, Phyllis Schlafly, who was a huge force pushing against this. And I know she was very much pro-life and started pursued the pro-life movement, but she also spoke a lot against no-fault divorce. But when women in particular, but men too in some cases, because again, this system benefits the person that's seeking the divorce. And so statistically speaking, women will tend to initiate the divorce process more than men. But in any case, if you know that you're going to get child custody and some alimony or whatever, you have the incentive to divorce as many men as you can marry. If that's your way of making a living, then keep doing it. I mean, there's no incentive not to do that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that her new ex-husband is now paying child support on my biological kids. So and then there's always these people who are like, well, why don't you go fight for them, get them back? Because I'm gonna expend all my resources. I barely make enough to, I just don't. For one, I don't have the extra money, and it's not gonna work because the system is just completely rigged against the man. Like, it's just,
yeah.
What are my chances? It's not worth the. It's just not gonna happen. But
Jeff, well, that's the unfortunate part. You've got a lot of. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Jeff Morgan, unilateral no-fault divorce. There's a predetermined outcome, which makes the entire divorce lawsuit a sham. No fault divorce equals the destruction of the family and the parent-child relationship. Destroy marriage, destroy the family, grandchildren and grandchildren, and destroy society. That's true.
Yeah, I think actually Vladimir Lenin quoted that in saying, "Destroy the family, destroy society." And so they understood very clearly that, again, the family is a bulwark also against the state, against the individual. I mean, it's a sort of intermediary between the individual and the state. And so what you see too is an expansion of government power, where now they're in control of micromanaging your life. They tell you which child goes where and who's going to pay for them. And you see crazy cases where men are paying for child support for non-biological children of other men. You see cases where there's 2 or 3 children, and the judge tells them, well, or there was a case, I think a family had 2 children, and the judge said, okay, one child, amongst you choose who wants to go with mom and who wants to go with dad. One of you are going with mom, one of you going with dad. And so, this kind of conduct by the state where they assume the parental role, in a sense, that's the whole welfare system, is that the state becomes this kind of parental role, deciding on these decisions on behalf of you, who essentially doesn't have any say at all. And this leads people to being susceptible to, again, this idea of communal childcare, public school education. All of a sudden, you have children being raised by the state, by social workers, paid for by their father, who is somewhere to be, who knows where, because the state has excluded him from seeing his children. And then you have children raised on this system, and they're susceptible to indoctrination. They're susceptible to not being able to develop the ability for conflict resolution, which is actually important. There may be couples that are fighting or whatever, but seeing their parents resolve conflict is essential for childhood development, psychological development. You see children susceptible to not being able to understand who they are as a person, and developing that identity. And so, now you see all of these other things creeping in, the LGBT militants, transgender education, and all this kind of stuff. It all stems from this breakdown of the family, and primarily through no-fault divorce, because people like to say, well, the culture is like that. People, we're so far gone that people want to divorce and stuff. That's only partially true, because the other side that nobody's talking about is that this has been institutionalized through our legal system. It's not necessarily that all people want to advocate for no-fault divorce. In fact, again, this is a very small lobby of family law attorneys who profit off this system. Most people would prefer there to be some kind of barrier that you have to breach before getting a divorce, so that it could stop them and prevent them from getting one. But this breakdown of society has now led to all of these other social problems that are just becoming rampant, and people want to ask why. And it's like, well, it's the breakdown of the family, it's the breakdown of marriage, and we've institutionalized it through our legal system.
Yeah. Mary's advocates wants you to, finish what happened in Russia. How did that? What's interesting? I think eventually the Soviets kind of changed their tune on that stuff, didn't they?
They did under Stalin, actually. Yeah. So initially, I think that, if I'm not mistaken, and there's actually some good literature on this too, Soviet legal innovation in the law of the Western world. It talks about some of this stuff and how it's influenced our society. But I think in 1918 was the introduction of mutual no-fault divorce, and then the Bolsheviks the radical wing took it a step further in 1926 to make it unilateral, and then in 1936, I believe, is when they kind of went back to some kind of mutual, or there had to be some kind of evaluation of sorts. And it was drawn a little bit back, I think, because there is such social devastation. This happened on a nationwide basis. With us, it happened incrementally, state by state. So it's kind of undetectable. But when it happens overnight in society, people tend to notice. And so this was actually quite a discussion in Russian society for quite a while. It left women in utter poverty. It left men, it left men and women in poverty. I think perhaps it was men in poverty more, and women, it was women with poverty and men essentially without their kids. And so, both sides lose from this. I mean, no side is better off. It's just devastating to the whole family structure. But the whole idea is that the state assumes totalitarian control over a sacrosanct, essentially microcosm, because that's what a family is a miniature society. And you lose that authority, you lose that sovereignty when the state is able to come in and take over. Just recently, I heard, actually, now with, you and I know a little bit about Russian society now, but they're trying to really Christianize again after 70 years of Soviet regime. And it's a slow, it takes time. It's a process. It doesn't happen overnight, especially when you have to recover from 70 years of this nihilism. But one of the things that they did recently, and I think it might have even been successful, is that they decriminalized domestic abuse. And the reason that they gave was because, not that they were in favor of domestic violence, but because they said that the family is sacred, and that that is not an area that the government should ever have control over in whatsoever. And so again, these are, if there's domestic violence, these are issues that the community, the extended family, the church community gets involved in, not something that the state assumes power over. And so, again, we can see the flip side of that here in the US, where domestic violence allegations are a common occurrence, mostly false allegations, as an excuse to put all sorts of restrictions on people not to see their kids.
Jared Holt's watching. It's gonna do a new hit piece. So, yeah. So what are lost my train of thought, but I got my head filled with Russia. But congrats, by the way, on your recent baptism in the Russian Orthodox Church, Russian Orthodox Church abroad. So by Metropolitan Jonah, who else, right?
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
Valid excuse not to be at the MAGA march, at the MAGA rally. So we'll give you a pass. But what are some of the court cases out there that you've been involved in and that we should keep an eye on?
Sure. So I mean, the prospects are unfortunately quite slim because of the direction that our country is going in, just the degeneracy and the social decay that's taking place. But there have been different people who have tried to push back on this stuff, especially related to this issue. There's been a number of attempts in various legislatures in Texas and in other places that have tried to alter the no-fault divorce law to at least make it mutual, not even to roll it back to what it used to be, proving fault, but at least to make it mutual. Because at this point, it's just one spouse that gets to decide all of this. These have been unfortunately unsuccessful attempts because, again, the family lawyers show up. I can tell you exactly who they are. They're called the family law section of the state bar. So they're part of the bar association. Underneath that, they're the family law section, and they pop up in all of these legislative sessions because they keep track of anyone trying to overturn no fault. And then they show up, and then they probably know the legislators, or give some kind of professional testimony. as to why this is such a terrible thing to restore the family. So some of these are legislative sessions that are, or attempts at trying to curb the unilateral aspect of no fault and at least making it a mutual thing, which I believe they have in Missouri and South Dakota, but I'm not sure if those are the two states. Because even though there are other grounds, like in New York, there's like 6 or 7 grounds. They have it left over from years ago. Unilateral no fault trumps them all. So, if you got one spouse saying, I want a divorce on adultery grounds, and the other one saying unilateral, they're going to take unilateral. So it doesn't matter. These historic laws are essentially on the books, but they have no purpose. So you're essentially stuck with unilateral. So that's the legislative side of things. Now, there's been a few cases in the courts that have taken place. There have been a few in the 1970s and 1980s when they were first introduced. Some of them unsuccessful, or all of them unsuccessful for various reasons. A few cases of late, one in Nebraska that took place not too long ago, and another one that was just issued or just filed in the Supreme Court, which I think perhaps has the best chance, if heard. Basically, what it argues is that the allegation of marriage being irretrievably broken is a viewpoint. So it doesn't refer to any sort of misconduct, but it's an opinion. Your opinion is that the marriage is irretrievably broken. My opinion is that it's not. So the case says that this law essentially is an ideological viewpoint statute. It doesn't refer to conduct. And the funny thing is that the courts in Pennsylvania, where this case is originated, actually said that indeed no fault has nothing to do with misconduct. So if that's the case, if it doesn't have to do with misconduct, then obviously that would lead one to believe that it is a viewpoint-based statute. And what's interesting about that is that we're seeing all sorts of First Amendment cases of late, whether it's compelled speech or viewpoint laws, which actually have been a thing recently, just because there's such an attack on the First Amendment, like there's never been before, that I actually think that this argument has validity to it, because what you're essentially saying is that the government is not regulating your conduct, not telling you, well, adultery is bad or abandonment is bad, but basically they're just endorsing or sponsoring one party's view that a marriage is irretrievably broken, which is just an opinion. It's a subjective opinion. So that's the argument that's being made under the Establishment Clause, because the Establishment Clause has been used in very broad ways to essentially say, one of the cases, Reynolds versus United States, said the powers of the legislature have authority to regulate conduct, but not opinions. And so the case being made in Pennsylvania is to say that the standard of irretrievably broken marriage is an opinion. It has nothing to do with conduct whatsoever. So we'll see if they take it. It's, they hear very few cases, like 1% to 2% of the cases that come to their desk. And I'm sure they're very busy with election cases coming their way. But it's a valiant effort, and again, it's pushing back against this system which originates from socialist ideology, feminism, LGBT militantism, and all in efforts to subvert the family structure and the traditional view of marriage and family. One person I would highly recommend reading is Dr. Stephen Baskerville. He wrote, his first book was Taken into Custody. This would be especially good for men who find themselves at the threat of going to jail because they've been bankrupt and can't pay their child what is it called?
Support.
Child support.
Child support.
The other book he more recently wrote was called The New Politics of Sex. This is a little bit broader, but it's excellent for anyone who wants to know how sexual ideology and politics intersect. which is definitely relevant for our current context.
Okay. What was the name of that first book again?
Oh, the first one was called Taken into Custody.
Taken into Custody. All right.
Yeah.
Cool. So if people want to help support this cause in general, how do since your organization was fake, non-existent.
It was premature. Let's say that.
How can people get involved in helping this, or at least building awareness and whatnot?
Well, you can find Jeff Morgan and I in this Facebook group called No Fault Divorce and Why It's Bad. So we have a little Facebook group there where a lot of people that have been affected by this have joined, and we share information there. You can contact us. And we also work very closely with two organizations, one called Mary's Advocates, which is primarily a Catholic organization, but that nonprofit does a lot of work on this issue, and it's one of the first places that I found in my research on this topic. And then another really great organization who does similar things is the Ruth Institute, and they're based down in Louisiana, but they're also very excellent. They were involved in writing an amicus brief against gay marriage when that reached the Supreme Court. They've done a lot of things on bioethics and the legal aspects of just biological identity and stuff like that, where now you have just ridiculous cases where a child wants to see their biological father, but because she's raised in a lesbian family, the court assumes that the lesbians are both the biological. They have to presume that the lesbians, because they're married, are the biological parents of the girl. So very anti-scientific, but somehow legally construed. I don't know how that works, but that's the backwardness that is taking place right now.
And I know Ronald Reagan said his biggest regret was signing that legislation. He should also regret closing the mental institutions, because a lot of these problems would just not be happening right now if we had nationalized mental institutions where we could send most of these crazy people. Ray, the musician, what did I miss? You missed you missed a lot, Ray. If you're just tuning in now, you're gonna have to watch the playback. But why don't you send a super chat while you're here? Ronald Reagan is big gay. Agreed. Ronald Reagan. I get so tired of boomers just talking about Reagan. Like Reagan sucked. But
yeah, so we'll see how this stuff pans out. But I mean, again, it's an issue that not a lot of people talk about. But when you pull the legs underneath the whole idea of the structure of family, and that's the whole idea too, is breaking down structure, breaking down hierarchy, basically breaking down order, because now all you have is chaos in the social relationships. And that's opened the door for all of this other stuff, and it's been going on for at least over 50 years. So I got, I and all these pro-family and pro-marriage organizations that say, oh yeah, we're for the family, blah, blah, blah. I mean, either they don't know about this issue at all, which I've found in some cases, or they just don't care, or they don't want to even touch this issue. Because again, they say, oh, it's we don't know what's going on with the Joneses, with the Smiths, and they don't understand this is a systemic structural problem happening across the whole country. Again, either they don't understand, or they're just cowards, which is what I suspect. I've gotten calls from like the Family Research Council, who's like, help fund our efforts to, fight against transgender education in the school system. And I'm like, that's great. You're about 50 years late. Can you work on no fault divorce? And they're like, nah. Tell us more about that issue.
Yeah, I do.
I mean,
I do actually like the Family Research Council. They're pretty darn
oh,
based.
absolutely. I'm not trying to bash them, but I guess my point is to say that all of these things that are happening right now, all of these efforts to push back on the cultural corruption that's taking place and decay, is all symptomatic of ultimately the breakdown of the family, which was a concerted effort to destroy the family by these nefarious groups.
That and birth control. So
yeah, that was a big one too. That's a big one too.
yeah, so we're gonna ban them both. Ban them both. Hey, one thing? So I actually inserted no fault divorce into Lauren Witzke's platform when I wrote it, but I didn't even put any thought into it. Like, it was just like, restore the family platform. Yeah, we're not letting you get a no fault divorce. Bam, because we're trying to increase the birth rates of the population without, so we don't have to rely on mass immigration, right? Like, it's just logic. If you're going to restrict immigration like we wanted to, we had to increase our native born population and provide incentive to do that. And, but one of the arguments that I would always get would be, but what if he's abused? What if I'm being abused? And I'm like, well, physical abuse I can see, but then I get the sense that a lot of what they're talking about is, yeah, like mental abuse. Well, I don't really know what you mean by that, because I don't. It seems like a bit of a slippery slope. So what would you? I just kind of want to get your opinion on what would actually fall under fault.
Yeah, well, that is the most frequent and common rebuttal that the other side brings to the table. And, it's this idea that you're forcing the government to keep the woman in an unwanted marriage. That's one thing. And then the other thing is this idea of mental, emotional, sexual, and physical abuse. I mean, there's lots of categories of abuse here that we're working in. And a lot of allegations are like just emotional and verbal and feelings. I felt like, and that kind of thing, it's I think that's easily rebuttable, because I mean that's just frivolous. Now, the physical violence, make a law for physical abuse. Make a ground for physical abuse. Grounds for divorce based on on domestic violence, or put a criminal claim in for it, because if it's a crime, put a criminal claim in. But this idea is that they say, well, she's afraid of retaliation if she comes out about it, or she can't prove it, or things like that. Well, first of all, nowadays with cell phones, it's pretty easy to record stuff like this. So I think that's a frivolous argument. But again, this is the whole idea of the social justice movement and the socialist ideology back in the Bolsheviks, is that individual is what level of justice are you willing to pursue in order to, or what are you willing to give up in order to pursue the perfect utopia? Because, on the one hand, there may be issues with proving abuse or having laws of abuse and fearing retribution. But the other side of that is destroying marriage, because then there's no standards, no protections, no enforceability whatsoever. And so it's this whole idea that, it's not the individual's fault, but it's society needs to perfect itself. And so they're looking for absolute utopia. And I just don't see how that's realistic. And the expense of that is you're destroying the institution of marriage. So I see what they're saying, and I'm sympathetic to especially physical violence and abuse. I just think that, number one, you could create a ground for divorce for that. And I think one of these states in the Midwest has done that, and they've tried to be as specific as possible, because even that's a slippery slope as to what constitutes, excessive, abuse. These are tricky things, and they need to be worked out for sure. And I that is one of the most common rebuttals that's given. But I just think that if you're going to go down that road, then you're going to be willing to just destroy marriage entirely, because then there's nothing you can do. There's nothing you have to prove. There's nothing you have to consent to, and it's essentially it's just essentially cohabitation. And so you're in a relationship based on momentary feelings, and you're just hoping that the other person doesn't back out on you before you do, So, and that creates a power struggle and a relationship of fear and anxiety. One of our jurists in America said that marriage actually elevated women in social status, because men were, this provides an environment where men aren't just sleeping around with every woman they see. They're actually committed to one woman. They provide for one woman. They have a family with one woman. And so it actually elevates the status of women so that they're cherished by one man in a relationship that is actually encouraged by society. But you have now these feminists who are saying, no, it's oppressive to women. So it's just an inversion, and that's what's going on. It's an inversion of what's happening. These people will say, well, you're forcing the government to keep a woman in an unwanted marriage. Well, we're saying you're actually having the government institute compulsory divorce. So, I mean, it's just a matter of perspective, and one's the truth and one's inversion, because you can't have it another way. It's one or the other. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. That's a good segue into reading one comment. None of this, we won't make any progress if we're going to completely slip away into a leftist dystopia if we don't go and support our president on December 12th in D.C. because, we know that he won the election and he's getting stolen. It's getting stolen. We got to stop the steal. So the first one was epic. So everyone should come out to the second one on December 12th in Washington, D.C. Or if you're in Georgia, go to Atlanta, go to the Capitol every day, tomorrow and Saturday. And then wherever Nick Fuentes and Alex Jones show up next, if you can make it, go. But anyways, back to the
it will be even bigger than the first one, right?
It will, because now we have time to 560,000 people came out with 5 days notice. That's insane. That's crazy.
That's pretty good for conservatives.
Yeah. Well, we're pissed off. So, and Ray the musician was there. I saw him get a shot, and he knocked Antifa out. He did a right hook, and he's short, so his right hook, he was like shooting up, but he caught the jaw of an Antifa, just straight laid him out. I think it was a girl, but whatever. We won't tell anybody. They have masks on. You can't tell.
Well, hey, they want to get involved. They're going to get punched. That's the name of the game. Yeah,
you F around with Ray the musician, you're going to find out. You're going to somebody was asking a question about can you talk about no fault after Oberfell, which is the big gay, right? So
yeah, well, I think I tend to try to avoid drawing a link because I don't want to legitimize Obergefell in any sense. I think the whole idea was if Obergefell was basically glorifying marriage as so important that we should expand rights to gay people, that it's hypocritical to say, well, you're somehow elevating marriage by saying that it should be accessible to gay people, but at the same time you allow no fault, which essentially undermines marriage completely. So it's just hypocritical to say that marriage is truly an institution to be cherished and valued if the state doesn't actually adhere to that. But that's as far as I would go in terms of linking the two, because in no way would I want to try to legitimize Obergefell in any way.
What are you, a bigot, Matthew? Are you a bigot?
Well, if I am, so are a bunch of justices that are vying to overturn it if Amy's on board.
Amy. But she's gonna ban birth control too.
Well, we just got to get rid of Roberts. That's what we have to do. We have to impeach Roberts, as Sidney Powell says.
That's true. That's true. I had a thought. Oh yeah. I mean, it's basically, if you want to look at this from an Orthodox perspective, civil marriages really aren't marriages. They're like they're cohabitation agreements that completely screw one party when it's ended.
Well, it's very interesting that you say that, because this whole project of mine and research and other stuff related to this topic over 4 years led me to the Orthodox Church. And it did so because of seeing, I mean, marriage is a sacrament, right? Meaning a mystery. And so when you delve into that and you try to grapple with all that's going on and how the dynamics actually play out and what we're doing in the civil sphere, you start understanding things a little bit differently. And it was one big issue that actually led me. I mean, first, initially, I was interacting a lot with Catholics because, of course, they have a very solid view on, or theology on marriage and divorce. But there are other things beyond that I can delve into in a different conversation that ultimately led me to Orthodoxy instead of Catholicism. But it had a lot to do with it, because marriage is a sacrament and you delve into it, and there's definitely a spiritual aspect. And I mean, you have to say that the Protestant Reformation had a lot to do with putting marriage and divorce in the hands of civil authorities and ultimately secular authorities. And so it completely divorced it from the church, and that's a big thing to dive into, but it's an important one, because you're absolutely right that now, I mean, again, marriage is Trinitarian if you think about it. I mean, it's Trinitarian in the sense that it's you, your spouse, and God, and it's also Trinitarian in the sense that it's you, your spouse, and your children. And when there are conflicts and when there are issues going on, there's an arbiter, and traditionally that's been divine law and the church's pastoral care over this institution. But we've transferred that to the secular institutions, and so now you have these secular institutions essentially fabricating or again, mimicking this idea of marriage, because we have kind of a parallel. You've got the sacrament of marriage and the church, and you've got now civil marriages in the courts in the state, and so it's kind of a mimicry, in a way.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. Jeff points out that Lenin did the same. Like he transferred marriage from the church jurisdiction of the church to the state. So.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Like because they were just technically speaking different civilizations, kind of different context of civilization. You have in Western Europe the Protestant Reformation moving towards the civil sphere of government, but at the same time the Bolshevik Revolution doing that as well, because the Orthodox Church was involved in marriage and divorce. And the communists essentially took that over, and their whole mantra was separation of church and state.
Never heard that. Never heard that before.
Well, I think they were inspired by 1776. I don't know.
Honestly, if we were gonna have well, this is why you got to move to West Virginia for our ortho trad state that we're building, right? But
there's land for sale there. Come on.
Yeah. So I think. I mean, the only reason you would even bother getting a civil marriage certificate to go along with your church marriage as an Orthodox is just so that you can get the tax cut, right? Or maybe if you're traveling, maybe if you want to move out of the country, you probably need your marriage certificate, right? That sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
But honestly, the church, the government should recognize, it should be only the church issuing these things, and then the church should recognize their certificates from the government should recognize the certificate from the churches. It should be the churches handling marriage.
Well, that, and that's initially what it was, is that the only purpose of the government was to register the marriage, not to govern it, not to regulate it, not to do any of that stuff, just to recognize it and to register it in their books. I mean, that's that's all it was doing at the time. But no, you're right. I mean, this gets into a much larger issue of like why young men would even decide to get a civil marriage license nowadays when it's actually more risky. And by risk, I don't mean like, oh, your heart's going to break and all this kind of stuff. No, I mean that the government's going to put you in jail. That's the risk, So, there's, all sorts of discussions with young men about like, if they really understand how this is working, that the state is expanding its power and basically exploiting you to redistribute wealth and basically take control of the family. There's really no incentive for young men to get a civil marriage license. And so for me, I was like, forget marriage and stuff. But then now coming to Orthodoxy, I was like, okay, now I understand, like I could do it in the church, and I would be fine with that. But it's, it does lead a lot to these questions, and then questioning the presuppositions of our historical founding, because it's like, we need to go back before the Enlightenment, before the Protestant Reformation, to kind of understand where we, how we got here, because this is just a logical progression of things that took place during the Enlightenment. Because, again, this whole idea of divorcing the church and the state, the spiritual and the temporal, and the religious aspect of marriage and the civil aspect of marriage. I mean, it's all just disintegration and separation and divorcing one from the other.
Yeah, that's true. And that's a very reactionary position of you, Matthew. I think you are a far right radical. Where did you get radicalized, man? Just that. When one contemplates and does some research, I think they become what modernists call radicals. It's true. Hey, you know what? I think getting bamboozled, just freaking run over by the divorce truck and the custody truck myself was probably, looking back, one of my my red pills. So
well, it opens your eyes to a very corrupt system that is very pervasive.
Yeah. Especially when you are a liberal at the time and you think that you're a feminist and you're totally getting screwed by this system of it's basically feminist. All of a sudden, that's a real slap in the face that'll wake you up a little bit.
Was that your turning point?
Yeah, and then being in Baltimore for race riots, that was another radicalizing turning point. But you know,
now you flipped, huh? You flipped the other way.
Yeah. Life hit me hard. The red pill of life hit me hard. So,
well, hopefully it hits a lot of people hard here pretty soon.
Anyways, I do this to every guest. You already kind of made some reading suggestions, but I do ask everyone to make one reading suggestion. So the rule for you is going to be expanded. It cannot be the Bible, and it cannot be a suggestion that you already made during the show. So one reading suggestion for the audience, would you please?
Oh boy, I actually wasn't expecting this question, even though I know you've asked it on other shows.
You thought you could get out of it by making suggestions during the show, but
there's exactly. I mean, I made a pretty good suggestion with the new politics of sex, but that's. Let me think here. What was one that I read recently?
There's no way to weasel out of this. It's a surprise at the end for everybody.
There's one that I started reading that counts, I hope. What is it? Well, just give me a quick second here. So I'm going to recommend, you've probably read it. It is The Rape of Man and Nature by Philip Sherrard.
The Rape of Man and Nature. I like it.
Yeah. Philip Sherrard.
I always write these down, but I have like 10 million books on my reading list, so But it is what it
Yeah,
is.
same here. I've got more books on my Amazon list than my reading list. So
Nice. I am reading the Screw Tape Letters from C.S. Lewis next because somebody loaned it to me, so I have to do it. And then I'm reading A History of Byzantium after that because I like to read better than the podcast. The podcast is good though, but I'm reading an actual book. Anyways, are you on Twitter or anything? Is there any way? I know you mentioned the Facebook group, but is there anything else?
No, I'm not on Twitter. The Facebook group is probably the best related to this topic, and people can find me there.
All right. Well, cool. I appreciate you coming on, Matthew. We'll have to bring you back for maybe to dive in a little more into some of this stuff, maybe more on a more specific angle.
Sure.
So, anyways,
Thanks,
thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I will actually be back on the air tomorrow night. I know I don't normally stream on Fridays, but we rescheduled Frank from Let's Be Frank from Sunday because we were both wiped from DC festivities, and so he will be here tomorrow. We'll probably talk about the march and all that stuff, normal politics again. So, anyways, see you all tomorrow night, unless he cancels on me. So, all right, bye.